All right, if you guys are interested in Retatrutide, this is a video that you're going to watch because we are going to break down really what looks to be the optimal dosages of Retatrutide and also some myths and misconceptions around Retatrutide, especially when it comes to the glucagon receptor agonist component. So the first thing we are going to look at is going to be the actual phase 2 clinical trial data that was published from the piece of the study. So this is going to look at the phase 2 clinical trial data. This is published on the New England Journal of Medicine website. If you Google that, you can actually find this information. But there's a few things that I want to take a look at here. So the first one is going to be this graph at the top here. And then we're also going to look at the side effect profile that would be associated with each of these things. And so if you look at the actual graph itself, we're going to see a few different things. So this is kind of like your key to understanding the graph. The placebo group is going to be your blue line. The groups that ran 1 milligram per week for the entire course of the clinical trial is going to be that light orange line. And then you have the group that started. ID denotes initial dose. So they started at 2 milligrams and increased to 4 milligrams. A group that started at 4 milligrams and stayed at 4 milligrams. A group that started at 2 milligrams went to 8 milligrams. A group that started at 4 milligrams went to 8 milligrams. And a group that started at 2 milligrams and went to 12 milligrams over the course of this trial. So there's a few things that I like to look at when it comes to this. One is, what was the length of this trial? So they ran this study for 48 weeks to really assess how people's body weight was changing over the course of that time period. You can see here that everything is really going to be compared to a placebo group that lost 2.1% of their body weight over the course of 48 weeks. If you look at it here, the 1 milligram per week group actually lost 8.7% of their body weight over the course of that 48-week period. So even the 1 milligram per week dosage did show to be relatively effective. If you look at the groups that started at 2 and went to 4, as well as the groups that started at 4 and went and stayed at 4, they lost between 16.3 and 17.8% of their body weight. So pretty significant in terms of weight loss, never going over 4 milligrams per week. If you compare that to something like semaglutide, where people were losing about 15% of their body weight over almost about 70 weeks, that is pretty significant to lose more weight with a small dose in a short period of time. Then we can look at the groups that started at 2 and went to 8 milligrams per week, as well as the groups that started at 4 and went to 8. You can see here the 2 milligram group that started at 2 and went to 8, they lost 21.7% of their body weight over the course of 48 weeks. That is a pretty significant amount of body weight for them to lose. And, even in a shorter period of time than tirzepatide, very similar results as the maxed out dosage of tirzepatide over a shorter period of time. The 4 milligram group the 8 milligram group that started at 4 milligrams and titrated up lost 23.9% of their body weight. And the groups that started at 2 and went to 12 lost 24.2% of their body weight. So what do I really take away from this data here? From what I see here is there is really no point in going over 8 milligrams per week. Yes, I understand that the group that started at 4 and went to 8 was very, very close in terms of weight loss to that group that started at 2 and went to 12. However, even the group that started at 2 and went to 8 still lost 21.7% of their body weight. So if you multiply that, that percentage difference with somebody that was 400 pounds, you're losing like 10, 12, 15 pounds difference over the course of basically a year. So you're using 50% more of the compound over that period of time to lose that little bit more weight. To me, the sweet spot for Retatrutide in terms of dosage really seems to be somewhere between this 4 and 8 milligram per week range. I think also when you look at this, another thing that's really important to look at is the side effect profile that's associated with it. I think it's always kind of funny and interesting to look at. You have your placebo group that actually had 11% of them. So the parentheses number is going to be the percentage of participants. And the number here is going to be the number of participants that experience these types of side effects. So 11% of people had nausea. 11% of people had diarrhea. Kind of funny to look at there with a group on a placebo. But you look at the amount, the percentages really here is what's important because the sample size was different for each of these, right? But if you look at that, the side effect profile that's associated with starting at 4 milligrams per week is significantly higher than the groups that started at 2 milligrams per week, almost double. And especially this group that went from 4 to 8, they had a lot of side effects if you look at it on this side effect profile kind of chart or table. And the groups that started at 2 and went to 12 also had a pretty significant amount of side effects. I mean, nausea seems to really be the biggest one that people are experiencing the differences in. And then also the vomiting. I don't know a lot of people personally from hearing people's experiences that actually experience vomiting when they're using something like Retatrutide. But in the clinical trials, there was a pretty significant amount of people that experienced that. But then you compare that to something like the graph up here that denotes the weight loss that people were losing over that period of time. And if you just look at the side effect profile, it really does not make sense to run up to this 12 milligram per week because you're going to have a lot of side effects that are associated with that. And so if you really start somewhere around 2 milligrams per week and maybe even titrate up to a maximum dosage of 8 milligrams per week, outside of the diarrhea component to it, it seems like you're really mitigating a lot of side effects while getting really significant results out of the compound. And so, I like to show that because I think a lot of people, you really want to find out what is the point in which you can get the most benefits with the least amount of side effects. And I think that 4 to 8 milligram range is really the sweet spot for it. They didn't test a 6 milligram group, but you could assume that a 6 milligram group would be somewhere in between that 4 and 8 milligrams. So somewhere maybe around 19% on average, I would say, somewhere in that range, 18, 19% on average weight loss over the 48 weeks had they tested it. They didn't, so we will never know until they do. But I would say that's a reasonable assumption. And so that's why, in my opinion, kind of the range to be between for Retatrutide is at 4 to 8 milligrams per week. I want to caveat that, though, and say that I think that staying as low as possible for as long as humanly possible is really the best thing to do. One, it's more cost effective. And two, if you can get results at lower amounts, that's fantastic. You have less side effects. You're still having a great experience. I've seen people use the lowest doses of GLPs for a year and lose 100 pounds, right? So there's nothing that really says that you have to use a very, very high amount to truly get a lot of results. I want to show to you guys too something where I think, there's a myth going around, and I always wondered where this stemmed from. And somebody sent me the article link when they asked the question last time, which really allowed me to really take a look at this and see. So this is going to be data from the phase 1 study for Retatrutide. And there's an excerpt in here that basically says that they noticed the most significant benefits with the glucagon component at the 4.5 and the 6 milligram groups. Well, if you look at the dosages that they administered during this portion of the trials, they only administered 0.1, 0.3, 1, 3, 4.5, and 6 milligrams per week for people that were using Retatrutide during this piece of the trial. And so the only thing that you have to look at in terms of the higher dosages is going to be the 4.5 and 6. And so the statement saying that they observed the highest number or the most significant activation of the glucagon receptor at those numbers makes sense because it's the highest dosages that they looked at during that portion of the study. But I want to try to, if I can, zoom in on this piece here. So this is going to be the fasting glucagon change from baseline across those dosage ranges. And so we can see here kind of how they look. You're going to lose that a little bit when I zoom in on this. I'll try to keep it as much as possible just to make it bigger for you to see. So what you can see here, the black dot on the black line is going to be your placebo group. And so you can see that kind of run through right here. And then every other dosage amount, you can see their individual and respective lines based off of kind of this key here at the bottom. And what you can see here is really the only group that didn't have that significant change is going to be that 0.1 milligram per week group. And it's not even per week. Let me also say something here. This was an ascending dosage where they only gave a singular dose. And they looked at that over the course of 43 weeks or 43 days and assessed how that was responding in somebody's body. So they gave a singular dose of 0.1, 0.3, 1, 3, 4.5, and 6. And they assessed how that was acting in the body over the course of 43 days. And what I want you to really look here to kind of dispel the myth of having to use 4 milligrams per week in order to get the glucagon receptor benefits is the fact that even when you look at that 0.3 milligram group, they did have a change from placebo. It was small. It was very small, right, in terms of their change from placebo, but they still had a change from placebo. If you look at the 1 milligram group, which is right below it, they also had a change in placebo or from placebo. If you look at the 3 milligram group, they did also have a change from placebo. And then you have down here the 4.5 and 6 milligram groups. And so I think the key takeaway from this, when you think about, do I have to get to 4 milligrams a week in order to get the glucagon receptor activation from retatrutide? From what this data shows right here during this portion of the trials, no. Now, this is 8 days in, this is 15 days in, where you can start to see those lines start to move back in the opposite direction. If you are continuing to administer this weekly, right, retatrutide has a 6-day half-life, so somewhere right here in this range is when you would be hitting the half-life period of retatrutide, and you would administer this typically once per week. If you were to continue to administer this once per week, somewhere around the 1 or 3 milligram dosage, and you continue to allow that saturation to build up in your system over that period of time, would you continue to get the glucagon receptor benefits from retatrutide? From what this shows, you should still continue to get the glucagon receptor activation benefits from retatrutide using dosages smaller than 4 milligrams per week. 3 milligrams per week is pretty significant, not super far off from those. And even at 1 milligram per week, you're still getting the benefits of the glucagon receptor over the placebo group. Now, again, they did not test a 2 milligram group during this portion of the trial, but you could expect it to be somewhere maybe around where that dashed line is between the 1 and the 3 milligram dosage groups, in terms of where that might fall along these lines on the graph. And so I think that's important because, I've seen a lot of people say that they're trying to get to the 4 milligram per week dosage in order to get benefits of the glucagon receptor agonist component of retatrutide. And what that shows is really it's not completely necessary to do so. And so I think that the concern of doing that for people that are trying to figure out the best dosages for retatrutide for them, hopefully this video kind of puts that to rest. And the thing about it too is that the other portions of the trials, they did not measure that directly, right? They mostly looked at the weight loss that people had and the side effect profiles and things like that. So, hopefully, and if anybody has any other data that they can find out there, definitely share that my way, because I would love to see something that directly correlates to say that you have to use at least 4 milligrams per week of retatrutide in order to get the glucagon receptor benefits from using retatrutide. So if this is information that you're interested in, I want to try to continue to make more types of YouTube videos, especially when you can break down the data and show that information. I also have a school community. You can find me on other social medias. I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok primarily. I have a Facebook community, but my school is really where I try to go in a little bit more in depth with things like this and break down this information outside of YouTube and publish that type of information. So definitely reach out if you guys have any questions. Drop a follow, subscribe on YouTube, and check me out on all the other social medias if this is some type of thing that you're interested in. And if you have any questions, let me know.